My name is Justin Reed, and I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible or Old Testament at Louisville Seminary. The courses that I teach often involve the history of how Black people have engaged with the Bible and the consequences of biblical interpretation on Black people and other minoritized communities. And so, with that in mind, I was invited to share this curriculum on honoring God's diversity. In 1968, two sanitation workers in Memphis were on duty during a rainstorm. They took shelter in the back of their own trash truck, but an electrical switch malfunctioned and crushed and killed both of them. Their names were Cole Cole and Robert Walker. They were both people who worked for Memphis's sanitation department, and they were treated like trash. They were crushed and killed like they were trash. They were treated like trash in their lives too, in terms of the poor level of their wages and in terms of the unsafe working conditions that they were going through. They weren't allowed to take shelter in white neighborhoods, and their truck had already been flagged as worn down and in need of replacement. In the aftermath of their death, their employers didn't want to pay their families compensation. In all these ways, they were treated like trash. And this is the origin for that famous "I am a man" sign that we see and know from the civil rights movement. When Dr. King was assassinated, he was in Memphis to support the sanitation workers' strike. He was standing in solidarity with these people who were oppressed by the combined forces of racism, classism, and our predatory capitalism that told them that they were less than human. Those signs, those "I am a man" signs, were a powerful statement. They were an enduring image seared into our collective memory of the civil rights movement. Those signs meant something because these people were being told by the systems and practices of this world that they're less than human. And so with these signs, they needed to affirm, "I am a man." When we read the Bible, we need to be intentional about affirming the full humanity of people who are oppressed by the systems and practices that are going on in our society. In this section, I take a look at Genesis 1:27, which in the NRSV reads, "So God created humanity in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." I want us to see that this beautiful verse can have a powerful impact when we're intentional about connecting it to specific groups of people who are too often marginalized from full inclusion in being treated and regarded as in the image of God. First, we think about male and female being in the image of God. Why are we so insistent often on only using masculine pronouns for God? Or if we consider ourselves more inclusive, gender neutral pronouns. Is there something wrong with calling God she? The logic of this sentence should push us to say there's nothing wrong with calling God she. And if we think more about it, I hope that we can imagine the benefits of using feminine pronouns to refer to God. That's the first challenge that I bring in terms of what it means to honor God's diversity using this verse. The second challenge, still thinking about gender, has to do with the fact that we understand a lot more about gender than a lot of us were raised thinking about. In terms of gender, more people are learning about the difference between biological sex, sex assigned at birth, and gender, and the fact that none of these is just a binary of two options. There are scientific, biological, and social scientific facts that dictate how this is true. For those of us who'd like to use the Bible in affirming the full humanity of all people, in this section, I try to reference how male and female is not necessarily this narrow binary, and it doesn't need to be read that way. This is what we call a merism. A merism is when we have two extremes, like male and female, used to encompass all that's between them. In Genesis 1, we see the same thing, a merism, happen with the use of evening and morning. Repeatedly, the text mentions that there was evening and morning, day 1, evening and morning, day 2, day 3, etc. By using these two terms, we know it obviously is not trying to say that there was evening and morning with nothing in between. There was no noon, there was no midnight, there was no dusk, no dawn. That's not what the text is trying to say. We understand that those two terms are meant to encompass all of the time space. The same thing is happening with male and female. Having that in mind allows us to be intentional about how we use this text to include everyone across the spectrum of gender and biological diversity as in the image of God. Finally, I point out the need to uphold this passage as central against other passages that we might bring to the foreground while pushing this one into the background. The Bible is huge. Inevitably, there's a potential to focus on one text and to have a more diffused view of other texts. I started this section by pointing out how we have done that with slavery in our history, where there are texts, like in Ephesians 6, that specifically command those who are enslaved to be obedient to their masters. And in the history of Christianity, people have said that is the text that's coming to the foreground when we're talking about slavery, and a text like Genesis 1:27 gets pushed to the background. Same thing's happening today in many communities where Christians say that a text like this same passage from Ephesians that says men should rule over women, that women should be submissive to their husbands, informs people to say that text comes to the foreground when we talk about relationships between humans, and Genesis 1:27 goes to the background. And what I'm saying here is that honoring God's diversity means that we really need to be intentional about bringing Genesis 1:27, where we say everyone, all humanity is in the image of God, male and female. That needs to come to the foreground, regardless of what other texts come up. Now, this presents a challenge for us to think about, well, can we really wrestle with other biblical texts in that way? And so as we keep going through the curriculum, we get a chance to think about creative ways to deal with multiple texts in the Bible that don't just take it as the word that we need to follow when it seems to be against honoring the full diversity that God has created on this earth.